And happy Monday. Hopefully, everybody is doing fantastic today. My name is Ryan Wong, and I am your MYP Design Subject Coordinator and the EdTech Specialist in Kangchao. And I am going to be your host for today. This is our first day of virtual learning or virtual conference, and we will be learning a lot from teachers and also our mentors about their teaching techniques and strategies from all over the world. Okay, now I have some few things to remind everybody. Okay, now for first one is the workshop will be recorded. Okay, and links will be provided to you later on afterwards. Now use the chat to introduce yourself or share your thoughts and experience. We encourage you to discuss during this session. Number 3 is Q&A will be available right after the session if you have further questions. All right, with that, all the housekeeping is out in the way. Now, and I'm going to turn over to today's features presenter, Jim Toscano. This session is about designing and empowering distance learning. All right, so I'll turn over to Jim now. Okay, Jim, you may share your screen.
Hi, Ryan. Sure.
Hello, Jim.
All right. Can you see my screen now?
Not yet.
Okay, let me try again.
Oh, the audience connection is a bit low. Okay.
All right. Sorry, I'm trying to share my screen.
Yeah, the audio is a bit choppy.
Okay. Let me check my settings. Okay, let me just change my internet connection, or is it working now? My audio.
It's better now.
It's better now.
Yeah.
All right. Now I have to. It says here that my screen is ready.
Yes. Yes.
Being presented. All right. Okay, so I just had to check something in my settings. Okay, so we're good.
Yeah.
All right.
Awesome.
Good morning, everyone. Right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jim, and it's an honor to be with everyone at Kangchao International School. Ryan is a friend of mine. I met him in Taichung in 2015, and your school is actually a school that is familiar with me because I teach in a Filipino-Chinese school in the Philippines, and I have one or two or three students coming from Kangchao when they moved over to the Philippines. So they've been, sharing stories about your school, and it's been it's a very interesting story all the time with those students of mine. All right, so let me start this with a short reflection activity. So we've been more than a year. I think you're going to start your new school year for this at this time of the pandemic. So my first question to everyone is, what has been your personal success in remote or distance teaching or learning? So maybe you can type in your thoughts in the chat box. Let's start with a very short reflection activity. What has been your personal success in remote or distance teaching? Correct. So just fire up your thoughts in the chat box, and may I invite everyone to get to go through the different answers or maybe sharing of your colleagues there. I love the first answer, getting the whole class to log in on time. You're not the only one. I think when I was giving this talk to a lot of schools overseas and in the Philippines, yeah, that's really a personal success that everyone wants to celebrate. Okay, so the final term for project was suited for going to online learning testing, not so much. Using the online platform, students engaging in discussion, taking attendance with everyone saying they are here without saying a word to them first. Teaching a cooking class, wow. Using Go Formative, giving a taste of virtual college class, using breakout rooms for discussion. Matthew Worth answered teaching a cooking class over an online or distance learning modality. It's so interesting. I would love to be in your class to see how you do this. I've found that problematic students are much less likely to distract their peers, making every single one attend the class. Finding new ways to monitor student work and engagement, getting students to be active and participate. Students were more engaged on their presentations. Also, they ended up doing lots of push-ups. As punishment. Oh, wow. Using Google Docs to see how we're doing work in real time. Breakout rooms. I never thought I would take this step. Well, Hetty, you're not the only one. I know a lot of even like teachers who were so scared with doing breakout rooms, but it's one way to go. Using the Google platform, only a few weeks of my old job, but learning the online platform effectively, keeping students engaged in their lesson, get my students to join each class and participate and engage. Wow, a lot of learnings there, and I really love that you shared about things that you wanted that you did for the first time. Um, just to share to you, during the first month of lockdowns in the global lockdowns that were happening simultaneously last year, that was I think around March 2020, I co-authored an independent report to UNESCO about distance learning. I co-authored it with colleagues of mine from Canada, Belgium, and Australia. And the very interesting insight there is that the rapid transition to distance learning as a modality, whether you're doing full online distance learning, hybrid learning, or for some, like for example in the Philippines, they do print-based distance learning where internet is not good at their place. The very interesting insight is that everyone was thrown into that rapid transition and no one was prepared for it. And there was a deeper reflection because the education system was meant for face-to-face learning and teaching. Even the preparatory stages for future teachers were meant for face-to-face education. So that was one big reflection because it now pushes us to further ask or maybe question the way we do education, especially at this time of the pandemic where it seems like the pandemic's not stopping, right? So how do we evolve from this? How do we move forward from this? And a lot of the answers really goes back to understanding the context of our students. One of the biggest consideration, if not the most essential consideration in doing distance learning or distance education, is understanding the context of the students. This is very much the same with face-to-face education. So by the way, distance education is a different animal as compared to face-to-face education. Of course, there will be intersections between the two, and that's, for example, online learning. But in distance education, what I want to share to you this morning is that distance education is a completely different field, right? And one of the things that we need to understand, especially when we transition, or maybe we shift, especially if there are, immediate lockdowns that are happening. Like, for example, in the Philippines right now, I'm based in Manila, where we are on our, we call it season 3. It's our third massive lockdown already. And yeah, it seems like we're not going back to the normal setup of education for the coming months. And one of the things that I want to emphasize is that when we talk about distance education, there is this one principle or one theory that really is very simple but should be kept in mind all the time. And I don't, for those who have gone distance education in college or masters, you cannot talk about teaching or learning in distance modality if you don't know about Moore's theory. So this is by Michael Moore, and it's really an old theory, and it argues that distance education is not just a physical thing. Distance education tries to remind us that it's not all about the physical gap, because the physical gap itself presents psychological and pedagogical gaps. One of the most important things that we need to remind ourselves then is that when we design learning experiences, especially when our students are so far away from us physically, we need to remind ourselves that there are psychological implications to it, that there are gaps, that there are barriers that will be affecting the way we interact with our students. Pedagogical itself, because I've seen in one of the comments, like even assessments and everything, the assessments that we deliver in face-to-face education might not work at all in distance education, especially when your students are answering the assessments at home, right? So it sort of throws everything that we have learned in face-to-face education. And it's not bad, because one of the main, I don't know, it's not a mortal sin or a rookie mistake, but one of the biggest reminders in distance education is that do not replicate what you can do in face-to-face education in online distance education, because they're completely different things. For example, assessments. While we want to do a lot of paper and pen tests, for examples, and digitize them, sometimes they might not be the most effective way of assessing student learning or student outcomes in distance education. A lot of you talk about, for example, looking for different ways to engage students, like breakout rooms, and all those kinds of different features that you see, the different platforms that you have. I think those are very good things, worthy to be explored because of the limitations that we have. I think one of the most important things to consider here is the psychological effect, especially because in distance education, students are studying on their own. Of course, they might have their tutors at home, or maybe an adult learning supervisors, or maybe their older brother or sister, or whoever staying with them. But there's a very the battle cry during the transition to distance education was Maslow. Maslow before Bloom. It's basically, we cannot teach our students, or of course you can teach your students, but you will not be able to make an impact on them if they're not well assured with their safety, security, and all those kinds of things. So this is a very simple idea, transactional distance, and every time you design your learning experiences, or every time you design all activities or programs in your school right now, even the non-academic aspect of education, the biggest question is, how can you lessen the gap? How can the gap be lessened, or if possible, close at all? Although distance education would say that it's very impossible to completely close the gap, because the distance between the students and the teacher. But if we constantly remind ourselves of this physical, psychological, and pedagogical gap between us and our students, then it's possible to aim for higher level of engagement, and even better learning outcomes. A few things to remind ourselves in online learning is that there are three key ideas in online learning. Principle number one: interactivity is the heart and soul of effective synchronous and asynchronous learning. Interactivity basically reminds us that when you want to engage your students, when you want to make an impact with your students, you have to make sure that you are taking advantage of the different modes of interaction in an online class. And later on we will find out that student to teacher or teacher to student interaction is not the only way through which we can interact with our students, especially if we talk about asynchronous learning. I'm pretty sure screen time is a discussion among you, maybe even something that your parents are asking you to consider. Therefore, you go for asynchronous learning. So how do you engage your students then when they are on their own, when they are doing independent learning, right? So let's talk about that later on. Principle number two reminds us of letting the students do most of the work. The operative word here is most of the work, especially for asynchronous learning. However, please be careful. Do not interpret this as letting the students a lot of work, or letting them do a lot of work or many work. It just simply means that when you want to engage the students, you need to make sure that the content is really interactive. When we speak of interactivity in the content, it basically means like I've always used the metaphor of content as I love food, so I love to eat. So if you want to entice your students to engage with your content, especially during asynchronous learning, you have to present your content as something delicious, something that they would want to get back to all the time. That's one of the simplest way of making sure that your content is something that your students want to interact with. So think of it. Look back to your learning experiences, look back to your content, and see if they're really enjoyable, if they're quote unquote delicious, right? Principle number three, I think this is very important to remind ourselves when we design our online learning experiences, our online classes, we need to make sure that there are three presences. Number one, does our learning experience promote community building, relationship building? Because in a way, there is this idea that we will be coming back to the classroom. There will be some points. Ryan has mentioned that you have been back to the classroom at some point. I'm not quite sure if that's correct. And then there are times when you have to not go to school again and do online learning or distance learning. It's very important that when you're doing online learning, you need to maintain that sense of community, the sense of relationship that holds your class together, right? It makes a difference when students can still feel that they are connected with each other, like they're connected with their teacher and with their classmates. The other presence is the cognitive or active learning presence. This is very much connected with number two. If you want to have active learning, of course, the principles of student centered learning, all those kinds of 21st century things that we are trying to promote, it should come out here. However, again, this is very much connected with your content, right? How do you make it enjoyable for the students? In online learning, actually, there is this idea of packaging the content so that it's easier for students to understand, right? You're not going to make things easier for the students through spoon feeding them everything, but it simply means that you teach directly what you need to teach, and then you focus on the deeper level of engagement and interaction with them. Like for example, drills, or letting them do more application or do more higher order thinking skills based experiences. And lastly, teaching presence. I think this is one of the most challenging aspect of the presences. How do you maintain your presence as a teacher when your students are studying on their own? Asynchronous learning, right? When you were designing your learning experiences, did you ask yourself if how your students would feel that you are present with them, right? So we don't talk about teacher presence. Instead, we talk about teaching presence. How do the faculties of a teacher or the teaching, how do we show our students that our presence as a teacher is not limited by our personal interaction with them? When they read the content that we have prepared for them for asynchronous learning, do they feel our presence, right? Or is it something that is very impersonal? Well, those are the things that we need to take a look in terms of online learning. When we talk about three C's, I think the easiest way to recall them is that your teaching presence should show that you are there to coach them, especially during asynchronous learning. You're not there to spoon feed everything, but they should feel your teaching presence as a coach. How do you inspire them? How do you lead them to make sure that they continue learning even if they are on their own and no one's looking at them, right? Learning presence basically means about basically talks about content and how do you enable active learning in those content. Or is it simply, read the article, watch the video, and get ready for our synchronous class, right? Or is it possible to let the students deepen their understanding of the content or even actively interact with the content on their own already? And of course, social presence, the last C is community. How do you make sure that the sense of community is there, especially because the sense of community can lead towards the development of collaboration, communication skills, and all those kinds of other 21st or essential uh, life skills that we want to promote. So regardless of the modality, whether you're doing face-to-face education, blended, hybrid, or maybe uh, you shift to a full online distance learning again, you need to make sure that these three C's are present. The three C's are present in the way you design your learning experiences. And I just want to focus on interaction first. Interaction is very, very important, and we need to remind ourselves that when we aim for deeper interaction with our students, we need to go beyond student to teacher interaction, especially when we always think of student to teacher interaction as something that you need to go online and listen to me and listen to my lecture or my discussion. A lot of teachers do online discussion, but if you want, because I'm also a department chairperson, so I get to observe teachers. And I really tell my teachers that, when you said that your strategy for that session is discussion, I timed your teacher talk, and it's sorts of 75-80% of the time it's always teacher talk. That's still lecture. I mean, you try to mask lecture with that kind of discussion. We need to change our mindset, especially with the synchronous classes. I don't know if you have TikTok. Do you have TikTok, or is someone doing some TikTok content creation there? When you go on TikTok, you can see a lot of how students are so proud of how they cheat their way out of online classes. And one of the key reasons there is that it's always teacher doing lecture. It's always teacher doing lecture, so it's easy for them to be tempted to do other stuff. Before, in face-to-face learning, we have what we call as death by PowerPoint, right? In face-to-face, we have death by PowerPoint. The young kids right now, or the kids right now, they have what we call as death by online lecture. It's basically because this teacher, this professor who loved lecture so much in face-to-face learning just basically transferred the whole lecture thing online in Zoom or Google Meet, right? So, those kind of things. That is what I meant by how do you engage your student with your content so that, they're deeply engaged with you. I'm not saying that lecture is bad. There's still wisdom to lecture. I would spend time listening to a lecturer if that lecturer is so good. But I always believe that being a good lecturer does not only depend on the expertise of a person, but also on the personality, of the teacher or a professor. So, it's a hit and miss for people to love lectures. But again, we can always remind ourselves that there are different ways to interact or to promote active learning for our students. It's okay, fine, you can do student to teacher interaction, but I recommend that that you that you make use of sessions for student to teacher interaction for example, clarifying misconceptions, right? Giving feedback. Don't spend it to lecture on things, because student to content interaction reminds us that if the students can acquire those basic knowledge and skills that you want to teach them, just let them interact with a very well designed content, like a module or something. So for example, you don't just, there are a lot of interactive videos online on YouTube, or even great articles that students can read, right? So you can try to imagine like flip learning. During asynchronous time, give those opportunities for the students to acquire those knowledge and skills. But then it would be better if you design your live synchronous classes as a way to check if they've really read or watched the material better, or well. You can use that for feedback giving. You can use that for other more important discussions per se, or maybe student-led discussions. So again, student to teacher, reserve that for high impact learning. Student to content, this is something that you want to look into more, because right now the bigger challenge is how do you make your online learning experiences, asynchronous learning experiences, or maybe modules more interactive for your students. Is it just simply giving them this assignment, read this in this website and be ready for our discussion next meeting? Or is it possible for you to design like formative learning activities that will ensure that your students have actually gotten something from what you have assigned for them, right? Another interaction that you want to quote and unquote exploit is called the student to students interaction, especially for older students, for more mature students who can already guide themselves. It's like in the classroom, you're giving them time to really work with each other. However, the main consideration here is that you need to be careful when you do student to students interaction, especially for independent learning. Because like in the classroom, if there are students who are not listening, who do not contribute to the whole group, it's also very, very possible for that to happen in online learning. So you need to design student to students interaction in a much better way, where there is responsibility, where there is accountability for all the students. There's a question here. What are examples? Here, actually, here are some examples of student to teacher interaction. Video conferencing, of course, that's the first one, right? Feedback giving. It's also possible to have teacher to student interaction without doing synchronous activities. So for example, I can see teacher Joyce could interact with student Sean through discussion forums, or maybe through feedback giving on assignments or journals. It's also possible, right? Email or chat correspondence is also possible. Consultation, mentoring or coaching students, or working with small groups of students. Basically, when you look at those non-synchronous examples of interaction with the students, you could couple them with your design, or you can embed them with your design on asynchronous learning experiences. Now that answers our question, how do we extend our teaching presence if we are not in synchronous classes? For example, I know that some schools, when they do asynchronous classes, the teachers are very much present online, whether it's in their Zoom classes or whether it's their chats or emails in their learning management system, because they know that it's possible that a lot of their students will be messaging them for clarification or feedback. right? So how do you make sure that your students can reach out to you, especially when they're doing independent learning? Because you want to ensure that when the students are doing independent learning, if they have a question, they can reach out to you. Because the worst thing that could happen is you let them learn on their own, and then if they don't understand something, they don't have someone to ask questions to, it might, it might lead them to a lot of misconceptions already. And sometimes it's very difficult to undo misconceptions or learning if they are built on misconceptions, right? So that could be one way of looking at it. Another example for student to students interaction: small group collaborative work or projects, collaborative brainstorming, group case studies, peer instruction, or even tutoring or feedback giving, email or chat correspondence. One of my favorites is actually discussion forum, especially if you're letting your students do a lot of independent learning and you're giving them materials to read or maybe to watch. You want to make sure that they actually did something, or they actually have gotten something from those materials. One way of doing that is creating a discussion forum where you ask questions that would lead the students to share what they have learned and even reply to their own to their classmates' thoughts. Mind you, even in open universities, for masters or PhD, they grade a lot of professors grade discussion forums. They use discussion forums as artifacts or evidence of learning. So it's possible that if you want to do that to your class, it's to your students, to make sure that they are really engaged or really learning, you can actually do that. Question is, we're basically forcing them, right? Yeah, we're not shy of that idea, because in a way you need to develop habit that habit of interacting habit of interaction among themselves, right? It might seem forced in the beginning, and like I said, I've done my master's in distance education online also. It felt forced, but it's one way of the professor ensuring that we get to study on our own. So there. Other examples that I want to show. um, Student to content. So how do we further unpack student to content interaction? Independent study with online resources, articles, or materials. This also answers the idea of differentiated instruction, or maybe giving more choices and voices, or choices, options for the students. There are different ways of how you can engage students through your content. So you can ask them to watch videos, tutorial videos, or maybe similar uh, materials that they can read or even listen to podcasts. I know a lot of teachers actually make use of podcasts, and they just lay these options down to their students. Okay, but all in all, they have the same goals. They have the same, how do you call that? They have the same objectives in doing asynchronous learning. But then in the end, the beauty of asynchronous learning is that you can give your students you call that options on how to acquire the required knowledge and skills. When you have learning acquisition or acquisition of knowledge and skill during asynchronous learning experiences, I would always recommend that you have a way for the students to check their understanding. So always make sure that there's a formative learning activity or formative assessment. So you don't have to make sure that there's a quiz, for example, at the end, or practice quiz or drill. It could be as simple as, just them going to a discussion forum and sharing 3 things that they've learned, 2 questions that they have, and 1 thing that I don't know, something like that. So you can look at, one of my favorite strategies is using visible thinking routines. The thinking routines are actually, we always couple our asynchronous learning acquisition strategies with thinking routines at the end, so that we get to have some evidence or artifacts that the students are really learning from or getting something from what they're reading. Web quest, doing research, or doing simulations. If you're into AR or VR, AR is being pushed right now by different big companies out there. And we recently partnered in our school with an AR company, and we're using this for science and math and social sciences. And it's very interactive for the students. And well, the effect is that they don't want to read anymore the articles being assigned to them. They just want to play with the AR stuff. But the teachers were very mindful of this effect, so they need to make sure that even the AR stuff that are being assigned to students are really worth their time. So you can explore. You can explore. It could be as simple as giving the students options like watching, reading, listening. It could be as high level as interacting with AR or VR content. So there. But always make sure that by the end of those activities, you have a way for the students to check for their own understanding. So it's like self-assessment at the end of those asynchronous experiences. Um, Other things that you want to consider is that when you design for distance learning, online distance learning, make sure that you have these 6 principles. Designing for relationship, which answers the social presence, community. So don't just design for independent learning. What if the use of breakout rooms, for example, like in the chat in the chat box that was mentioned, that actually promotes collaborative learning, communication skills, all those kinds of things. Relationship also talks about how this teacher reaches out to the students, right? So do not only focus on the academic stuff. Most of the time, if students are not doing well in online learning, there are quite serious reasons behind it. So it might be good also, even if you're not a guidance counselor, if you're a teacher, basically interact with your students and ask them why, number one, they're not submitting their work. Or number two, why are they not doing well? There's always a reason out there. And it's always the job of the teacher to uncover those reasons. We talk about interaction. We talk about, we will talk about later about learner agency and wayfinding. Designing for feedback is very important. Authenticity, design authentic assessments basically as a way for you to better assess students when they're doing online distance learning. I will not talk about appropriate tools and resources because the speakers after me I think will be sharing their best practices on this. But the big idea of appropriate tools and resources is they should be developmentally appropriate for your students. It's always one consideration that you have to understand. We talk about context, so therefore, when we make use of learning platforms, online learning platforms, they should be developmentally appropriate for our students. So yeah, I want to focus right now on designing for feedback. Like in the normal face-to-face education, feedback is very important. I'm pretty sure you've heard about this or learned about this already. But just a caution, in distance education, people fail. Like those getting their college degree, master's and PhD, they sort of fail in distance education because one of the top reasons is that their professors or teachers do not give them immediate feedback. So the lack of feedback actually contributes to that to the failure, quote and unquote, of students. They feel disheartened because there's no immediate feedback, and it's very dangerous because if the student has learned something and it's wrong, and there's no immediate feedback to it, the student is actually unknowingly building on misconceptions. Like what I've said a while ago, it will be difficult to undo those misconceptions if the feedback is delivered late, right? So, of course, the big challenge right now is when you design online learning experiences, you have to strategically embed all those formative activities or assessment. You don't have to design formative assessments all the time. It simply means that any activity that lets the student reflect or check their understanding or for their understanding, it becomes a formative activity, right? So it's as simple as that. So what are those examples? I have here on the screen, they could be as simple as online quizzes with automated feedback mechanism. That is very important when you're doing asynchronous learning, right? Because the teacher is not there to give feedback. It's not as simple as, like for example, in Quizlet, oh, the answer is wrong, my answer is wrong, then I'll just proceed to the next number or to the next item. It should not be like that because we want to design independent learning experiences that have automated feedback mechanism so that immediately the student knows that his or her answer might be incorrect or is incorrect. So you have to make sure that you have this automated feedback mechanism. Another thing that you want to make do is, if you want to create your own content, you can look at Edpuzzle or maybe go to Khan Academy or get videos from YouTube and then put them in Edpuzzle so that you can have your own embedded formative questions there. Someone mentioned about Go Formative here. It's also very good. Um, Most of the time, especially for the younger students, sometimes not them not knowing how to write their explanation, for example, doesn't mean that they don't know anything. It might lead us to open more about how do we know that our students are learning something. So it might be good to do screencasting or maybe yung screen recording when we ask the students to record themselves explaining things, what they have learned. For example, in math or even other subjects, for example. My favorite is actually doing portfolio as a way of making sure that my students have evidences of learning. So our favorite really is as simple as seesaw. When we ask our students to really post their work, or maybe teachers create formative learning activities. For older students, they can have their own learning portfolio, Google Sites, for example. Our teachers create templates for our students so that they can have more portfolios also. What else? There are a lot of examples out there if you just go online, but one of my favorite really are discussion threads or discussion boards. Um, you want to make sure that you post good questions that would allow for discussion to happen. Do not post questions that have one answer, because if the students got the correct answer, then the discussion ends, right? So you want to make sure that you have a question that will lead to more questions. Um, Learning management systems, like for example, we use Schoology in our school. They have a very good discussion board feature, right? We also personally, because I've been teaching senior high school students in a distance mode even before the pandemic. I always require them to make at least two replies, or maybe to reply to at least two of their classmates. When I grade their participation, it's not really on how correct their answers are. It's how sound may be their reasoning. Because grading them according to the correctness of their answer will limit the discussion. So it could be like, for participation's sake, it just could be for accomplishing something. So it could be something like that. Feedback poll, for example, you can always do that. Sorry, my mic is breaking in or out. Okay, sorry for that. I think it's my internet connection. Okay. One of my favorite actually is sharing of checklists or rubrics. I've always every time I let my students do independent learning, the first thing that they see is the checklist or the learning goals. I don't share to them the learning objective because that's for me as a teacher. Instead, I try to rephrase all the learning goals in such a way that they can better understand what they need to do for that asynchronous learning experience. So, especially if you're teaching younger students who may need support from parents, if you state if you have a checklist, for example, of the things that needs to be done, it gives the student it's like a roadmap, a map that they can follow on their own. The worst thing that could happen is simply just assigning the students an asynchronous learning experience and they don't know what to do, right? So make sure that you have checklists, or maybe if you're doing assessment rubrics. By the way, just a tip: what I do with rubrics, for example, in terms of assessment, I show them the rubrics, but then in the end, I get the highest, set of rubric, for example, A plus rubrics, and then I translate that as goals for them. So when I do assessment with my students, I explain the rubrics, but then I shift their attention to the goal of that assessment. And the goal of that assessment is basically the highest, set of rubrics for the highest grade. I always do that to make sure that my students aim for the best work that they can do. I don't know if that will work with you as a teacher, as an individual, but that's one way of me making sure that my students really aim for the highest or the best possible thing that they can do. Designing for learning agency. We know what learning agency is, right? Making them they have choice, voice, but the most important thing is that they have a sense of responsibility on the choices or actions that they do. Wayfinding is a very interesting aspect of distance education or online learning. Um, Wayfinding basically means that the design of our learning experiences should ensure an easy and efficient, learning navigation on the side of our students, right? Because we want our students to focus on the learning experience, not on navigating our LMS, for example, looking for this material, downloading this, or whatever. So a very important aspect, this is even non-academic aspect. It does not even talk about pedagogical approaches already. It simply reminds us that when we design our learning experiences, we promote learner agency and wayfinding. So for example, sorry for the long list, but these are the tips that I usually share. Making the learning goals or targets for the module or online learning experience very clear. State it on the level of the students. Most of the time, there are teachers who would state it in their own language. But when you're designing asynchronous or independent learning, make sure that it's articulated in the level of the students. Checklists are very, very important to guide the students on what they need to do on when they're working on their own. When you design modules and learning materials, I always follow this principle, MAMI principle. Minimal activities, maximum impact. It's always this. When you design your asynchronous learning, aim for minimalism. Minimal activities. You don't have to design a lot of activities. You design for minimal activities, but make sure that they have high impact on learning. This also avoids us wasting the time of our students. Also because when students see that there are a lot of activities, they usually lose interest, right? Even as teachers, when we see a lot of things that needs to be done, we lose interest, right? Or we just force ourselves to do things. But I always love this principle. I've learned this from my principal. When you design your learning activities, whether face-to-face actually or online, design a few learning activities, but make sure that they have the highest impact for the students. Okay. What else? Chunking. Chunking is very important also. When you design or create or package your content, for example, you don't let your student watch long videos like 30 or 1 hour video instructional materials. Psychology of learning actually reminds us that the best videos or the limit to instructional videos should be like around 6 to 10 videos only. Think of TED Ed videos. You know how TED Ed videos are so short, but you get a lot of learning from them. That's actually what is being reminded to us when we when we want to, does your chunking refer to metacognitive technique? Yeah, it also talks about that. So here you could put in neuroscience, metacognitive approaches, all those kinds of things. Psychology of learning. This is basic psychology, right? If we want, if we want ourselves to remember information, we chunk them, right? 60 to 10-minute videos, not 60 to 10 videos. So 60 to 10-minute videos. Um, Enable choice, very important. Enable choice in knowledge and skill acquisition. And then one of my favorite, it's called recommendation. It's called the alien analogy. Alien analogy basically means that imagine if an alien visits your home and reads your content or goes through your content. If the alien has a lot of questions, that means that your lesson design might not be at its prime, or might not be very effective. Because try to imagine if the student is learning on his or her own and she has a lot of questions, number one, in how to go through your independent learning or asynchronous learning experience, or maybe even even the content itself, it's very hard to understand for them. It might need some revision. So I've always used this as a reminder for myself, alien analogy. If an alien comes to my home and visits me and goes through my learning experiences, will there be a lot of questions about the content itself? It's good, well, it's good for students to have questions as they interact with the content, because you know that learning is happening. But if the questions are basically about, it's hard for them to go through it because the design itself is not good, there's no chunking or whatever, all those kinds of things, like the logistical, or maybe all those stuff, it might be very difficult for them to undergo it. So alien analogy. Um, Cognitive overload. Cognitive overload is real for the students. Cognitive overload is really real for our students. So it might be also good, that I emphasized a while ago, 6 to 10 minute videos might be good for them. If you could lessen them, it's okay also. Um, Instructional materials that are video based are not designed like movies, right? You can sit through a movie and be engaged with the movie most of the time, even if they're 2 hour long. But for most of the time, for the students, when they look at instructional videos, they are reminded that they are learning something, and they want to be engaged. So if the instructional materials are not engaging enough, they would really find it difficult to get what you're supposed to teach them there. So cognitive overload is real. So make sure that we remind ourselves of this thing. How about synchronous learning? When we talk about agency, we want to take advantage of synchronous classes. It's always good to lead, to make sure that the students take the lead in in discussions. So, like what you're doing in the classroom, when you allow the students to lead all the learning experiences, or maybe even undergo through synchronous classes, with them taking the lead in the discussion, then that's fine also. It's also one way of powering up your synchronous classes. May I give you a note also in terms of agency and wayfinding during discussion forums, or maybe in your discussion forums? It's always good to have protocols in place, especially because discussion forums are meant for asynchronous learning, which means that the students will be coming in and out, typing in their answers, sharing their thoughts without you there. You're not gonna monitor, you're not monitoring the discussion forum 24/7. I'm not quite sure if you will if you will enjoy that, right? So make sure that when the students go to discussion forums, there is a protocol that needs to be followed. It could be as simple as courtesy and respect in posting their answers, right? It could also mean as simple as How do you type your thoughts? Do you use capital letters? Is it okay to use emojis, for example? In my class, because I also, well, not in my class, but the classes of my teachers in the grade school, especially the younger ones, I encourage the use of emojis in class or emoticons, for so that it's easier for their classmates and the teacher to know how they're feeling or what's the feeling behind the statement. So because text-based interaction could be easily misinterpreted by other people. One last tip I would like to remind everyone is minimizing clicks. If you have an LMS, make sure that you put everything in that LMS, right? If you can embed photos and you can embed videos or different asset instructional materials in one single page or maybe in one single folder in it, it's better because the more outside link that the students have to click and read through or whatever or browse through, the more temptations that will come in. So if it's possible, try to minimize clicks. Put everything in one single page or maybe in one single folder so that the attention of the student remains on that single folder or maybe single website. So there are a lot of things that needs to be considered when we're designing for online distance learning. But then again, it's as simple as these six principles: designing for relationship, designing for interaction, designing for learner agency and wayfinding, designing for feedback, appropriate tools and resources, and authenticity. I did not talk about feedback and authenticity anymore because I'm pretty sure you guys know more about feedback giving and authentic assessments out there. But the most important thing really is, like what I've said a while ago, interaction is very, very essential. Asynchronous learning does not mean, assigning something and letting them do this on their own time. It means having a very structured learning experiences or learning experience that students can undergo on their own. But that interaction should still show feedback mechanism, active learning strategies, even authentic learning strategies or assessments embedded in it. And that interaction should enable learner development of learner agency. At the same time, allow them to find their way or navigate their way easily so that they can focus on the more essential aspect of that learning experience. So yeah, so these are the things that you need to consider. And for my to end everything, I think one thing that we need to remind ourselves as teachers right now, last year we had to do distance learning for the first time, right? And I'm pretty sure it's very important that we look into the things that we have done successfully. The things that you have done successfully, bring them with you in the coming school year. Whether you're doing online learning, face-to-face learning, especially because you're using technology right now. The bigger invitation is that after this pandemic, after this online learning, when we go back to the classroom, do we bring in the things that we have learned, the best practices that we have in from using technology, and how do we incorporate that in face-to-face learning? So again, congratulations, kudos to everyone. I think everyone deserves a massive congratulations because you have survived first year of education pandemic. But then right now you're gonna welcome another school year, and I'm pretty sure you guys would do well in making sure that your students are engaged and that you deliver the best quality of education. So there, thank you everyone, and yeah, thank you for
Thank
that.
you, Jim. Okay, thank you, Jim. We learned a lot today, and then we have a lot of ideas for the new school year. I think Frankie has some questions about how to do Mami in the classroom.
Oh yeah,
Give an example.
Mami in the classroom, like the physical classroom or online classroom, or
Maybe
both.
we can concentrate in an online classroom.
Well, in online classroom, here's the thing. Mommy basically means that you go direct to the point, because number one, we know that screen time is precious for our students. It's precious for us. So instead of wasting your time with different activities that might not be well connected with what you're supposed to teach, why not go directly with the lesson itself? Does it mean that you go do direct instruction? It could be as simple as that.
Okay.
Most of that, I don't know. This is just a comparison, and I don't know if this is happening also in your school. But a lot of the schools that I've given workshop to, teachers would love to have activities, especially at the beginning of their classes. And most of the time, the connection really is just 1 to 2 sentences, like the main connection to the main lesson. It sorts of preps them for the main lesson, but then my observation is that you could have just done that in a minute or two, and just prepared your class for that main lesson. So go directly to the main lesson, or mommy principle could also mean that all the things that the students can do on their own, let them do those on their own, so that when you go to synchronous classes, focus on feedback giving,
Okay.
focus on clarifying misconception, or maybe focus on allowing the students to interact, or maybe work with each other. So that is mommy principle. um, it's basically means, sorry for the very straightforward statement, don't waste the time of your students.
True.
Don't waste the time of your students. If you can go directly to the main point, go directly.
Okay. All right. It's already 10:30, so we'll come back at 11 o'clock for the second session. Will be the bite-sized session from our teachers. Uh, uh, the same link, and then for those teachers who have further questions, we will still be online. All right. See you at 11. Do anybody have any questions?
For those you have questions, I can stay here.
Yeah.
If there are questions, maybe if I can speak to the teachers have questions.
Hey, Ryan, are we going to use the same chat room
We
for
will
11
be
o'clock?
using the same chat, Google Meet link.
Okay, so I don't need to leave the room then.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
Okay. All right. If there's no question, if you want to ask question, please maybe you can type it in or just ask question directly.
Hi Jay, how are you?
I'm good. Can you see Manita's question?
Yeah. Hi Jay, nice to see you again.
Yes.
Okay, Manita asks, I have a question. How should teachers juggle or adjust teaching instructional strategies in hybrid classroom? This is a very difficult question because this is also a very difficult thing to do in reality. We've
Yeah.
been preparing for hybrid classroom, and um, there's this challenge in designing learning experiences, because most of the time we either design for on-site learning or full online learning, right?
Mhm.
The biggest consideration here is when you adjust instructional strategies, you need to make sure that that instructional strategy works well with both on-site students and online students. Does that make sense? Like